My name is Stephanie Steinberg. I am the founder of the Detroit Writing Room and also the New York Writing Room. And we have a nonprofit arm called Coaching Detroit Forward, which works with Detroit high school students on writing and photography. Um, I'm going to put people on mute as they're joining in. And so I'm very excited to have Bob here tonight. Some of the tickets benefited Coaching Detroit Forward, so thank you to those who donated to our nonprofit arm. Our guest of honor tonight is obviously Bob Campbell, who came out with a new novel, Motown Man. I'm really excited to hear some readings tonight, and we'll also have a chance for Q&A at the end, so you guys can ask some questions and discuss the book. If you haven't gotten a copy yet, I'm going to put the link in the chat box, but it was also in the email that I sent out with the Zoom link. And there's a promo code, so you can get $5 off too. So with that, Bob, it's a pleasure to welcome you to our virtual Detroit Writing Room community right now. Feel free to take it away.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. I'm really excited about it. Debut novel, worked on it for a little while. And so, anytime as a writer, it's always, it's a pretty solitary exercise. It's always exciting to get a chance to share some of your work with readers. And not only with those who buy your book or loan it, you borrow it from the library, what have you, but actually in a setting like this, we can have a bit of a dialogue about it, and so I'm really excited about it. So, Motown Man is a literary novel set in a city very much like the city of Flint, early 90s. I grew up in Flint, and it is a story of an interracial romance between Bradley and Abby in looking to build a life in a faded industrial town. And during it's a 5-day odyssey during unseasonably cold week in November. And they're engaged to be married. Abby is away on a business trip. She's a journalist. Abby's a journalist, newspaper reporter for the Flint Daily News. Bradley works for an automotive components plant, which is a division of General Motors. So, but they're separated during this week. Abby's at a diversity training seminar. Meanwhile, Bradley is still at home because he's working on a large changeover project for his company, for the automotive company he works for. And this time is also a period for them to kind of put in to sort of take a step back, if you will, to kind of put their relationship in perspective. Use a little bit of a downtime to kind of evaluate, this is what we really want to do, and that kind of thing, which is not uncommon, I think, for people who are engaged to be married. They have not set a date yet. So I have a couple of, on the title, Motown Man, it's, a lot of people think it's about Detroit Motown or about Motown music, neither of which is true, but it sort of speaks to, I'm a big fan of Motown music, let me say that now, but the title sort of derived from a conversation between two characters. The main character, Bradley, and his younger brother, James. And it sort of emerged as a bit of a dig, if you will, from James's standpoint. But it's as but the title itself is sort of kind of captured the larger theme of the story, somewhat in keeping with Berry Gordy's vision for Motown music when he founded the company, is that it was the music or the sound of young America. And so, the Motown sound, particularly the early to the mid 60s sound, was this very, vibrant, buoyant, all American pop sound, and kind of spoke to this new generation of America. So there's a little bit of a play on that as well. So a couple of sections I want to read to you actually are in the middle, more the middle sections of the book, and they center around the fathers of the soon-to-be or would-be bride and groom. Um, Provides a bit of a backstory to both the setting where the story takes place, as well as I think it even sort of speaks to some degree about a little bit of the contemporary climate, even though this story takes place in 1991, November 1991 to be specific. So with that, I will jump in and go from there. Ellis, Ellis Cunningham. Ellis never worked in the shop, unlike many of his friends and customers. For him, it was an oppressive place. He grew up watching his daddy come home day after day, broken down, exhausted from the heat of the Buick foundry. The work was filthy, backbreaking, and dangerous, but it was one of the few jobs blacks could get in the shop when his father arrived here from Georgia in 1921. The only other jobs were in plant sanitation, and even then, it could still be difficult for black men to get in the door. His father, Ernest, was born at the turn of the century in Georgia and was nicknamed Sam because of an experience he had with a hiring clerk at Buick years ago during the Great Migration. When he went to apply for a job, the white man looked at him and said, "What's your name, Sam?" "Yeah," replied an angry Ernest. So that's how Ernest Cunningham came to be known as Sam among his family and coworkers. It was their little inside joke. Ellis told his sons about passing by in the summertime and seeing all the guys laid out on the yard, probably on the edge of heat exhaustion without even knowing it. The job had black written all over it, Ellis concluded, and it's why he never wanted to work in the shop. He didn't want to be constantly reminded it was the only job he could get in the factory, and he didn't want to be reminded of anything negative connected with being black. That's why he hated to see or read about some black person fucking up. And although Ellis generally avoided the use of such profanity, he even frowned on it in his barbershop and would tell a customer to watch his mouth if his language became too foul. But in his private thoughts, only fuck captured the depths of his anger and frustration. Few things upset him more than black folks fucking up. Not because blacks are supposed to be perfect, but because white folks think blacks are supposed to be perfect. But because white folks think that we are. Before we were less than human, he said. Now we're supposed to be superhuman. No, it wasn't fair, but he knew the score and he wanted his boys to know it as well. Though he never stepped foot in the factory, he seemed especially proud of Bradley. Equipped with an engineering degree, Bradley had entered the place on his terms, Ellis believed. That was key. It paid well and the benefits were good. And if that's what his son wanted to do, well, he was all for it. Ellis liked cutting hair and enjoyed the barbershop camaraderie. He built his shop into a fine establishment on the city's south side, and it took many long hours of standing on his feet, listening to a lot of shit talkers and an occasional burglary, but he did it. Although his prices were a little higher than other shops, his many loyal customers didn't seem to mind too much. His barbers all wore matching smocks, and his shop was a training ground for many apprentice barbers through the years. He even sponsored a Little League team for the neighborhood boys some years ago. He wanted a professional operation where people could relax and trust him to be there. He also needed the stability because he had two boys to raise. It wasn't unheard of for Ellis to open the shop at 8 in the morning and be there until after midnight. And because he often worked long, sometimes irregular hours, Bradley and his brother James spent plenty of time at Grandma and Grandpa's house. Ellis never dated much during those years, and the boys recalled very few women coming by the house to visit their father. Years later, they learned that Daddy sometimes took extended lunch or dinner breaks to make house calls on lady friends. And when Bradley asked once why he hadn't remarried while the boys were growing up, Dad was matter of fact. What do you say to a woman when you've got two small boys? Would you like to get married and raise my sons for me? What woman really wants to do that? A woman wants to care for her own babies. And I already had two, and I wasn't looking to add on. When he did remarry a few years later, after James graduated from high school, Bradley was initially, though quietly, resentful of his father's new bride. He was jealous. Sure, he could relax somewhat now that his children had completed high school, but Bradley had heard stories about how the old man was a little more fun before mom was killed. He was looser, more relaxed. His mother's early death transformed his father into someone more cautious and serious. Almost overnight, he went from being a daddy who roused his boys from the bed in the morning, singing the chorus from James Brown's hit, Get Up, to a father who taught his sons how to use an alarm clock. Bradley had hoped to see the father of his early youth resurrected in some way, to be a part of it, once he had been relieved of the pressures of raising two boys alone. What exactly would they have done together? He had no idea, really. They didn't hunt or fish. But when Frida emerged from the background and became Ellis's wife, Bradley felt as if she were stealing precious time from him. Bradley also felt that maybe his father had been avoiding James and him during their formative years and simply used the demands of the barbershop as a convenient excuse. Ironically, Bradley thought about calling Frida Mama once his maturity was restored. The boys wanted so much to have a mother to buy a Mother's Day present for. Bradley thought it would be quaint to call Frida Mama, even though she had grown children of her own from a previous marriage. Calling her by her first name seemed not quite respectful enough. Not that it was disrespectful, but the first name basis didn't seem to put her on par with her mate, his father. Calling her Mrs. Cunningham seemed awkward, stilted, and cold. So for a long time, he simply addressed her carefully without the use of any names or titles. But that too seemed to be a denial of her existence and a cop out. Eventually, he settled on calling his father's wife Frida, and she didn't seem to mind at all being called by her name. They didn't talk often about Abby. Ellis didn't approve of the living arrangements and said so. It was so uncharacteristic of his son's otherwise deliberate approach to life. After being told that Abby was now sharing Bradley's house in Grand Heights, the father cut to the chase. So whose stuff is it really? The son replied half jokingly that it was still his house and Abby only lived there. Besides, she still has a place of her own, she said. And he said, joking or not, Ellis was unconvinced. Oh, I see, he said. 1 foot in, 1 foot out. So y'all don't really live together, huh? And Bradley wondered whether his father's disapproval of their living arrangements was simply another one of his convenient excuses. He suspected his father was equally troubled, if not more so, of his interracial courtship. That was the word, according to James, who said, Daddy-O says he'll be happy when you get over your white girl thing once and for all. Unmoved, Bradley pushed back against his brother's unsolicited perspective. Are you speaking for Dad now or yourself? Hard to know if Dad actually said that or if James was simply being James, Bradley concluded. But he knew his father thought the city and country, for that matter, still very much had problems with matters of race. He had said on more than one occasion in the barbershop how white folks love to play the blame game. Just look at all those fiascos downtown, he said. All of them, ill-conceived, pie in the sky nonsense. And one day he just went off. All these factories started closing up. All those easy money jobs started drying up. Now the city's broke and going to hell. Whose fault is it? Black folks. When open housing came, man, it was no open housing. Hell no. White folks split, Jack. And that was that. Oh yeah, now we black folks can be something else too. But to hear these white folks tell it, they ain't nothing whatsoever. They didn't have nothing whatsoever to do with the state of things. And that's some bull. His father's tirade was rather surprising because he generally kept his frustrations to himself. He rarely used his voice to vent. How could he? What could they possibly do with that kind of information? Recognizing and avoiding direct threats to your immediate personal safety is one thing. Subjective threats require a different kind of defense, however. So he simply tried to make sure they were prepared. On the topic of Bradley's romantic choices, he told Frida that even though he was less than enthusiastic about his son crossing the color line, a part of him wanted to believe couples like that were okay, that there really was no different, that they really were no different than other relationships. I remember the first time he brought home one of your little white gals, he told Bradley sometime after Bradley announced his engagement. I thought, what is this little Negro trying to do? Why does he want to hurt himself like that? What would his mother think? I even thought that maybe I hadn't brought enough black women around for you to see. Bradley remembered that day as well. The first time he brought a white girl home, he was a college freshman at the time. It was a Sunday afternoon. His father was sitting in the living room with Aunt Josephine when Bradley walked through the door with this white girl. His father stood up, greeted the pair, and promptly excused himself from the room. Even Bradley misread the reaction. He thought his father was just being polite, giving the two a little privacy. Aunt Josephine also left the room a short time later so her brother's exit wouldn't look so clumsy. But when Bradley went into the kitchen to get himself and the girl a pop, he saw a tormented man leaning against the counter, frowning at the floor. His father couldn't even look him in the eye. And over time, things began to change. So, that's a little bit of the background about Bradley and his relationship with his father, and a little bit about his relationship with his brother James. He's a couple years younger. And so I want to sort of position that against a section on Abby's father. Now Abby is in Miami at a diversity training workshop, and they're going through these different, each day, it's there for 5 days, each day is a different race or ethnicity. So on this particular day, she she was listening to a presentation about Asian Americans from the presenter named Daniel Yang. And he had started off talking a little bit about the myth of the model minority. And so I'll pick up with Abby as she sort of, as she's listening to this presentation, kind of lapses into thinking about her own life and specifically her father. So with that, I'll jump in. A model minority. The description had resonance for Abby. Was Daniel correct in surmising that the portrayal of Asian Americans as America's perfect house guests as a not so subtle swipe at blacks? Absolutely. In the view of certain family members, notably her father, Bradley could have been any other race and it would have been okay, she thought. Not ideal, but okay. In her father's view, blacks were different. Though not exotic, they stood out too much. Yet it wasn't a matter of language that set them apart. No, it was something else. Blacks seemingly had an indefinable quality of separateness. Perhaps it was their skin color and kinky hair. Maybe it's because they had no native place to call their own, like wandering children longing for their motherland. Whatever it was, Dennis Larson really couldn't understand what his daughter saw in that black man. He and Bradley were certainly nothing alike, he thought, except they were both men with love for Abby. Not that, nor would life get any easier for her by marrying him. This world already has enough problems, he counseled. Why add this one to the mix? You can do badly all by yourself, he concluded. Dennis more or less treated his black customers no differently than any others, and even disallowed the use of the word nigger in his home. But this same man regarded his daughter's pending interracial marriage as something akin to a rich girl foregoing her inheritance and marrying beneath her. It didn't matter to him that Abby's only inheritance was her white skin, that and maybe the shoe store he owned. But that was beside the point. He focused instead on the future grandchildren. No doubt they would be black, even if they looked white. They would be black and forever marked with that indefinable quality of separateness. And if they came out with permanently brown skin, which is quite likely because of Bradley's complexion, there could be no faking it for the white grandparents pushing the stroller through the park. Could he love a grandchild in the same way? Love meaning, would he be able to see himself in his daughter's offspring and give to them what his grandfather had given to him? Would they be his grandchildren or theirs? He wondered. Her father was one of those men of his generation lucky enough to experience some kind of survivor's guilt. Vietnam got hot a bit after his time had passed, which, Abby concluded, caused him to undergo a period of self-examination of what he might have done if called upon to serve. To make matters worse, he had grown up with a guy whose kid brother was still listed as missing in action somewhere in Southeast Asia. To honor his memory of the neighborhood boy, Dennis sported an MIA sticker on his car's bumper, which caused Bradley to remark to Abby once, "You should tell him he's not coming back." A mean thing to say, she thought at the time. It seemed to her, it seemed her father spent hours, countless hours watching television documentaries on the war of his generation, analyzing it as if the outcome could have been altered somehow. His grandfather, excuse me, her grandfather was awarded a Purple Heart during World War II after taking shrapnel while serving somewhere in Italy. Abby suspected her father wondered privately whether he measured up to that man, but not enough to enlist in the service. Perhaps it was easier and less complicated to imagine it instead. His grandfather, her grandfather didn't volunteer for the war. He was drafted. And since his number wasn't called, Dennis spent the 60s at home watching the civil rights movement unfold on the flickering, sometimes snowy screen of a black and white television set. He felt sorry for the black marchers and the protesters and even entertained the idea of participating himself in some fashion. But there were some things a young married father must pass on if it isn't necessary or central to one's primary responsibilities. So he avoided active participation in those historic events, observing from afar as young whites demonstrated alongside blacks. The so-called sexual revolution passed him by too. He could identify with the mission to stop the madness in the South. He lived vicariously through them all the way until the faint cries of Black Power began wafting north. While it may have satisfied a longing for some sort of empowerment, those words joined together, that phrase added an IR to the struggle, turning it into their struggle. Put off by the fiery rhetoric he heard, he wondered if any white person had a place in this proposed country ruled by Black Power. So he stopped paying attention to their cause and concentrated on, on the business of fixing and selling shoes for running and walking. And in his own way, Dennis helped to ensure he wouldn't have to worry about whether he'd ever have a place in the country ruled by Black Power. Then his only daughter became smitten with the black guy. But hell, it was more than that now. They were engaged. Abby and Bradley were leaning towards a small private affair for family members and a few close friends. Initially, they talked about something large and expensive. Now they thought a modest gathering would be more intimate, personal, and romantic, instead of some conspicuous, overdone celebration, as if King's dream had been realized. Privately, the idea of seeing a church with all the black people seated on one side and the white people on the other was too much to think about on what was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives. Granted, seating based on whether a guest was closest to the bride or the groom was traditional and expected. But skin color contrasts always seemed to complicate these otherwise trivial distinctions. Abby's mom wasn't exactly thrilled by her daughter's decision to marry outside her race either. But unlike her ex-husband, she didn't see it as the end of all things. Everyone would keep his or her comfortable distance, and that would be that. Besides, she said, Abby would discover soon enough that all men were created equal. When her father finally met Bradley, Abby recalled the two men shook hands like the heads of two states, one vanquished, the other victorious. Dennis was more or less pleasant, not unlike the way he treated his black customers in the store. Still, Dennis looked as though he had to swallow hard as he prepared to hand over property lost as part of some brokered peace accord. Abby's mind drifted back into the present as Daniel Yang shared a few more stories about the indignities that took place on Angel Island. The speaker then made another observation. If this is how America treated members of its model minority class, what did it say for members of the other groups who weren't as fortunate as those of us of Asian descent? Okay.
Thank you, Bob, for those readings. You guys are welcome to go off mute and offer comments and chime in. That's okay to take yourself off mute.
It does feel weird not to applaud, so yay.
Great job, Robert.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, Bob.
Aria, you're a little echoey, so I'm just going to mute you and let's see you have a question. But thank you again. I'm going to open this up to be sort of an interactive discussion. If anyone has questions, you're welcome to just kind of wave your hand. I'll call on you. Or if you don't have the capability to talk, you can use the chat box as well, and I'll monitor that too. But if anyone wants to ask a question or give a comment, you're welcome to.
I have a question just to start out with. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why you wanted to set this in 1991 in particular. Like what was like, I mean, that the more I think about it, the more interesting that year seems, but I'd love to hear what why your imagination found a home for this story right then, and specifically November.
Sure. Well, the story itself, the story was kind of, I got the idea for the story from a news story that happened in Flint around the same time. And I won't elaborate on it so as not to give away too much of the story. So that was kind of the trigger period. Now, how I arrived at specifically November, it was kind of a mixture of things. One, with the relationship itself, because even though they were engaged, and this is kind of it's a bit of an allegory on the challenges or the hopes or what have you for some kind of interracial communion. That's one of the themes of the story. And so by having this separation with Abby being in Florida and Bradley still being in Michigan, that allowed them this time to kind of put their relationship in perspective. But it couldn't go on too long. I mean, it's sort of like, okay, we have this week apart, we can kind of mull things over. Whereas if this uncertainty had lasted 6 months or more, it's kind of like, do these two really need to be talking about getting married if they're having that kind of uncertainty? And so, so with that in mind, I guess I just kind of searched around for a period of time that seemed to make sense. And I know how I arrived at that specific week. There's another incident in the story that happened around Halloween. And it was a blackface incident that Bradley is exposed to. One of these plant executives went to a party dressed in blackface, and this other other foreman is telling Bradley about this the following Monday, and he's kind of like, "Oh, damn, what the hell?" Um, and so when I decided to use that story, that incident within this story, the following week seemed to make sense. So then I start building around that week after Halloween. The thing that's really interesting about that is once I settled on that week, there were some other pieces, as you're kind of doing um, research for a story. And being a former journalist, um, realism and real events are important for me. I kind of like building stories around um, a real life fictional world, so to speak. But there were some other incidents that happened during that week that fit in so nicely, and it was just purely by luck that they kind of fell into place. Um, so, so again, it kind of I ended up landing on that first week in November on the basis of this blackface incident that happened for Halloween.
That's a great question, Anna. Ariane, I see you have your hand raised. Feel free to go.
Yes. So it's Ariane and Bob. One of the things that I really liked was the different things in your book as being a person that knew you from the time you were in first grade to be able to read some of the parts and truly be able to notice what you were pulling in from your childhood experiences. Um, it really made me be able to get into the storyboard. Just want to let you know that. Kudos for that. I was going to ask how you came up with the idea, but being a person that also writes, how long did, from beginning to end, did this take you? And during that journey, how many times did you just get total writer's block?
Yeah. So I'm sorry. Were you
I
done?
was done.
Okay.
I was done.
So if I if I stack my days of writing end to end to end, without any breaks, I don't know, it probably took me 4 or 5 years, but there were periods when I got the idea again. Um, I started working at the Flint Journal, but didn't know how to write a novel. So it took some time to kind of learn how to write. So I didn't really start, even though I had kind of nibbled around with some short stories here and there. Um, I think one or two of them kind of found a life in the book. I didn't really start on the novel itself probably until the late '90s when I really sort of um, went at it in earnest. When I was kind of like writing almost every day, and at that time it was probably 2 or 3 years in getting that first draft done. And when I was done, I'm like, cool, out to the agents, out to the publishers, this bad boy's ready. And um, little did I know that there was still a lot more revision to that needed to be done on the manuscript. And so that period then, it took another, I don't know, 10 years. But when I say 10 years, I wasn't working on it the entire time. There was a time when I fooled around with the manuscript for a while, and I put it away for like a number of years. My son was playing sports, travel sports, and really off into his activities and things like that. So I really put it away. I put it so far away, in fact, that I thought I'd lost the manuscript. because we had changed computers, and you know, when you're moving files from your old computer to the new computer, for some reason it didn't get transferred over to a newer computer. And so when I had kind of got the inspiration again to get back into the story, I was like, damn it, where, you know, what did I do with my manuscript, you know? And it finally dawned on me that it was stored in an old computer. And so I finally pulled it out of there and jumped back into it and did um, about 2014. Wow, man, 2014. That's a few years ago now. That's when I did a heavy rewrite on the story. Cut it down, probably by about a third. And that's when it really became the story that it is now. Changed the name. I had a different working title for a long time. Um, and that's when this new title, the eventual title, kind of came to me. So, I mean, that's a long bus trip to your question, but it was kind of, there were a lot of starts and stops along the way.
Cool. Thank you very much.
And I see Wanda joined us. Welcome, Wanda. We did some introductions in the beginning, so you're welcome to introduce yourself and share where you are, where you're from, or if you've read the book or not. You're on mute, so you'll have to go off mute.
Here we go. So hi, I'm Wanda Campbell, and yes, I have read the book, love the book. Of course, I'm Bob Campbell's wife, but I have a question that I haven't asked him, so I will ask it now. My question is, being where we are in 2021, although you wrote that book many, many years ago, what opportunities exist right now to take those conversations, take those settings, pull them forward to 2020, 2021, to have real conversation with people of other races, so we can actually learn to talk and communicate better with each other?
Whoa. You could have slipped me that one before.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think that, you know, one of the things I really like about writing fiction is it allows you to explore some topics, some difficult subjects in a way that doesn't put another person on the spot, so to speak. Not to say that sometimes you don't need to have those face-to-face conversations, because you do. But I'm hopeful that it's the kind of story that you could use it as a conversation starter about, you know, like let's take Abby's father for example. You know, what kind of things he's feeling internally and how he sees himself, his family coming together or not with this other family. And that was sort of kind of the vehicle that I used here, using this engagement, was a way to get at this whole idea of how do two families, or how do two communities sort of come together. What do you keep and share? What do you abandon? But how do you have those conversations in a way that is healthy for both sides, so that both families feel a part of this one larger family? So so I think that's one part of it. There's some other pieces in the story, like I made reference to the Blackface incident, where this one boss, well, it wasn't Bradley's boss, but he had dealings with him, tells him this story about this other guy wearing blackface to a party, and I didn't, and in that section, after this guy has the gall to tell him this story, Bradley asked him, okay, cool. It's like, so were there any black people at this party? And of course they weren't. But the idea that, why would he think it's cool to tell some kind of story like that? Or maybe, the guy who told the story was as outraged by it or not, although, he didn't get any indication from the conversation, but just sort of being able to put yourself in another person's shoes, I think is important. And so again, kind of circling back around to your question, I think that the kind of conversations that we're having now, are sort of the same kinds of conversations or issues that were being talked about in the story, from diversity training to, called bias training now, or diversity training, and you know, and how you make sense of that, um, um, or not. And so again, I think that there are, and then the other piece too, all of those issues kind of playing out in a community that's very much in transition. This one time very prosperous blue collar factory town, has come down considerably from its heyday, and how people are jockeying, communities are jockeying for their place to to make their way, or to preserve their place, and how do you do that in a way that you know makes room for others as well. So thank you for that question.
Thank you, and I'm glad you're here. I always love seeing husbands and wives supporting each other at these events, and parents too. That they tend to chime in as well sometimes. I actually have a question too. I'm a journalist as well, and I struggle with writing fiction. Just I think it's ingrained into me to tell the truth and quote people as what they said is what they said. So when I go to make something up, I just kind of freeze. Did you have any challenges in transitioning to fiction?
Yeah, I did, because kind of like as what you just said there. Um, you're kind of reporting what you've heard, what you've uncovered, what's real. But at the same time, I like to listen to the way people talk, and so in in making up, let's say in crafting dialogue, for example, I find that to be very helpful in really kind of getting the rhythm, the cadence of the way people speak, and how it applies to a situation, what it reveals about what I think it may reveal about that person's personality or not. Um, a lot of, I do a lot of research into trying to understand different nuances of, situations, and then just kind of extrapolate from there, and just kind of trust that what you have put together sounds credible, and then it helps too to have a reader, a beta reader, to kind of say, yeah, that works, or yeah, no, that doesn't work. But sort of going back to dialogue for a moment real quick. So I was in the I was in the barbershop one day several years back, and guys in there just kind of talking stuff and whatnot. And one of the guys who were in there was talking about when he played high school football, and what kind of player he was. And someone had asked him, and he was a defensive back. I don't how much you know about football or not. But and someone asked him, yeah, okay, well, how many interceptions did you get, when you played ball? And he's like, yeah, one or two. He's saying, but my specialty was knockouts, meaning that, delivering hard hits. And I thought that was like such a great line. I gotta use that sometime. And it's actually a short sentence in the book that. And that came directly from just kind of overhearing this conversation of two people talking. So, just kind of, you kind of picking up things along the way and figuring out what fits, what doesn't, and sometimes kind of based on this accumulation of things that you've acquired, it's kind of like, okay, I think I can make this leap to say something like this. So
Yeah, no, that's cool. I never thought about, you can still use bits of real life in a fictional story too, of course. That makes sense. um, well, Amber, did you have anything that you wanted to ask if you're still hanging with us?
No, just taking it all in, just
Uh,
being an active listener today.
all right. I appreciate you being here. Anybody else? We can still keep it going if there's other questions. Well, I have to say thank you to Anna for introducing Bob and myself. I believe you guys met through a podcast, was that?
I mean, we did do a thing. Well, when did I don't even remember the first time I met you, but it was a while ago.
I think
We did do some like kind of event, bookish kind of event things.
I think it was at the Flint Writers Festival.
Maybe that was it. It was like some years ago, but just basically when I was like hanging around more in Flint and being particularly interested in writers, our paths inevitably crossed. And yeah, it was great. So yeah, so I think I like read his writing before I met him in person too, because he's done all these stories and things that are fun and entertaining to read, like for Belt and places like that.
Oh yeah.
So you still do journalism basically every once in a while?
Yeah, I do some creative nonfiction essay stuff, which I enjoy. I like it's a quicker turnaround a lot of times. I mean, they're shorter pieces. I haven't done any book length nonfiction yet, but yeah.
I mean, you just did this book that was clearly a huge amount of effort. So that's like, I don't think it's crazy that you weren't also working on like other books.
Yeah, it was funny though that I remember when I got the acceptance email from the publisher, Urban Farmhouse, and it was in November, first week in November, oddly enough, and so then you just you have this euphoria. I'm like, oh yeah, this is great, and then you go through this period of editing and COVID and everything, and it, so it's a whole different other process after you get done with the story and getting it into print. At least with this case, in this case it was. So it was an interesting experience, but I'm very very thankful that I was able to find a publisher and get the story published. I do think that it sort of dropped at an interesting time. You always kind of hope that, well, in the kind of fiction that interests me, interests me most, I should say, you always, kind of want to have a sense that it kind of speaks to a contemporary world. And even though, again, this is 30 years old in terms of when it's set, I still think that a lot of the themes and issues are very much contemporary. So that's a good feeling.
Do you have another story you're thinking about writing for another book?
Actually, I do. I started outlining and still working on the outline on a story that, well, I just read something about Ernest Hemingway saying you don't want to jinx yourself by saying too much. But yeah, a story again set in a city like Flint, and quite possibly Flint, because one of the something that has I've been thinking about as I continue to think about the story is setting it against the backdrop of the Flint water emergency. So, not a story about that per se, but just kind of that looming in the background. because I do think that stories, that are built around, what's happening in a given community. Not that the community or the setting is a character so much, but how that setting influences and affects the characters themselves and the life that those characters lead. So, and I also have this kind of like this unending fascination with the Vietnam War. So, there may be some elements related to that too, with the story that I'm kind of envisioning, after the fact,
Well, we'll stay tuned. We won't jinx anything, I promise. Well, thank you. Does anyone have any final questions or comments?
Thanks for sharing all this. It's lovely. It's a great way to spend an evening.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for everyone for coming out.
Yes,
Braving the snow. No.
Thank you guys, and everyone who's watching the video recap as well. Thank you, Bob, for sharing portions of your story and making us all probably want to go out and buy it now and read it. So everyone, please do buy a copy of the book and use the promo code. I put it in the chat box, and I'll email it out again as well. But if you're interested, we have actually a couple more book talks this month. This Saturday, we're doing a book talk fundraiser. So the writing room is partnering with Coaching Detroit Forward, our nonprofit arm, and we're hosting a fundraiser for Detroit literacy nonprofits. And so the proceeds are split between Beyond Basics, Progressionista, which is a book club for Detroit girls, and also Coaching Detroit Forward. So it's this Saturday at 11, and it's with the author of I, Detroit, Marcus Lyon. He spent 3 years putting together this book that features 100 Detroiters that were nominated to be featured in this book. And I wish I had it next to me, but you can like scan the page with your phone, and the person that like you're scanning will start talking. So it's like a cool interactive book. It's like worth $260 because of that. And we're giving away a copy on Saturday if you attend. So I mentioned that because I think
that's crazy. I had no idea that book.
Yeah. Copy at the writing room, Anna, so you can check it out the next time you're there. So it's quite a project. And then we also were featuring Rochelle Riley on Tuesday. She's a former Detroit Free Press journalist and City of Detroit arts director. She just came out with a new book, That They Lived, African Americans Who Changed the World. So that should be a great talk on Tuesday at 7 o'clock. So if you guys feel like joining us again, everything's on our events page at DetroitWritingRoom.com. But again, thank you so much, Bob, for sharing this evening with us and sharing your story. And I wish you much success in going out and, promoting this during a pandemic, because I know that's been challenging for a lot of authors. So good luck to you, and enjoy, stay safe, everybody, in this crazy snow if you're in Michigan.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed it.